Aloha! Welcome to the Live Ukulele podcast. My name is Brad Bordessa. Thank you for tuning in. This episode is about phrasing, which you might say, I don't know if you would, but you could possibly make the case that phrasing is the most important part of music. It's what makes music breathe, makes it alive, makes artistry pop. It makes our favorite artists really sound like they do. And we'll talk all about it. And I'll play some examples and share some thoughts with you about phrasing and how you can work on integrating phrasing, more conscious phrasing into your playing. Before we do that, though, this is the last podcast that's going to be published before the Ukes for Ukraine live stream event. If you're just hearing about it, this is a fundraiser that we are putting on to benefit World Central Kitchen, who is out in Ukraine providing warm meals for refugees. They're getting money to restaurants directly and just telling them, cook all the food for all the people, and we're going to just keep you going. And that's what they've been doing. They have their own camps that they set up. A lot of times they're along the borders to catch the refugees. So as they come off the trains, there is a warm meal waiting for them, no strings attached. And because food is such a cultural thing around the world and everybody appreciates the value of a good meal, it seemed like the appropriate kind of cause to support. And so the stream is going to be workshops mainly, but with a handful of performances and maybe a few songs played by each artist. And we have joining us Tobias Eloff, Neil Chin, Kevin Carroll, Victoria Vox. I might or might not teach. My time slot I kind of put in there as the stretch time slot in case something else comes up. My mentor, Kiyoki Kahumoku, will be joining me for a couple songs at the very end. And the whole thing is held together. The glue for the tech side of running the stream is Craig Chi and Sarah Mizell, and they will be also leading a workshop in the afternoon. You can find out more details about the stream through the link that I'll put in the podcast description. It's just liveukulele.com/Ukraine. And you can go there and check out the lineup, check out the handouts, and kind of the workshop descriptions. Everything's subject to change, but at this point, I'm feeling pretty good. Like we've got it pretty much dialed in. It's going to be a fun day of learning. Please come join us. It's free to tune in. We're just trying to raise awareness of World Central Kitchen's work, raise some money for them, and also stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine as they go through this devastating time. April 9th, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.-ish, Hawaii Standard Time. April 9th, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. So there's a big window that you can jump in. You might not be able to catch everything depending on how busy you have planned out your Saturday on April 9th. But we'd love to have you for however long you can tune in. If you can afford to drop something in the hat, please do so. The YouTube stream is very cool in that YouTube pays for all transaction fees. So 100% of your proceeds go to World Central Kitchen. We've already raised almost $1,300 even before the stream. So that feels pretty good. That's really cool. And, it's not about the monetary value, but we're just trying to create that support for the folks of Ukraine and, show that we are thinking about them and just coming together as the ukulele community to represent and to lend whatever help we can. So I hope you'll join us April 9th. Put it on your calendar. Sign up for a reminder on the YouTube page. And like I said, there are more details at liveukulele.com/Ukraine. Really super hope to see you there. Tell your friends, share it out. There's a flyer on the page that you can download and put on your Facebook. Anything that you can do to spread the word would be greatly appreciated. This is a very grassroots thing. We are just shooting from the hip, doing what we can, doing what we can. So I'll see you there. Let's get into phrasing. So phrasing is basically how you play something in music. It's the texture, the kind of inflection that you put on your notes, the attitude of your notes, the timing of your notes, and the cadence of the notes, and the push and the pull of what you play. And I say notes, but phrasing can actually be any part of music. You can phrase dynamics, you can phrase rhythms, you can phrase tone, you can phrase all of these different things. It's just that notes is usually what folks think of first. And so, as a super basic example of phrasing, I'm going to play you Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I'm going to play it super straight first. That's the recognizable version that you've heard a million times. The way that I played it is very cut and dried, how you'd expect. But if I were to phrase it differently, what I can do is I can push and pull certain aspects of what's happening. And this is what creates a little bit more musical interest. It's a little bit of a surprise. Even though you know what the melody is, it might be different because the phrasing changes. For instance, I pushed and pulled some of the notes around so that where they were occurring was a little bit off, but it's still recognizable because the melody is still there. It's kind of the swag that you might put on a melody or the clothes that you dress it up in. And really, phrasing is the most complicated thing in music. It's the most complicated, but it's also the most simple. Perhaps one of the best and most accessible examples of phrasing is to relate it to speech. If you're talking to somebody who is a very good orator, somebody who can say things out loud and make them very engaging and nice to listen to, I'm sure you can name off a bunch of people who you like to hear talk. It's probably because those people have good phrasing, and the cadence of what they say and how they say it and how they phrase it all together is what makes it dynamic and interesting. Whereas if you think of somebody who maybe you don't like to listen to so much, maybe they ramble on and on and on and they never leave breaks in their words and there's kind of no life to it, they might be lacking phrasing, or the phrasing that they use is not very interesting and it doesn't lend that life to the speech. And so the same goes for music, is you can play anything completely straight, and a lot of times when you're learning something, you aim to play it as straight as possible because that's kind of the baseline. But once you know something better, you can sort of start to change things and make them more interesting, change the rhythm, change the phrasing, change the attitude. So I think this is going to be a podcast with a lot of examples because I don't necessarily know how to spell this out with words quite as well as I'm sure somebody who's a more classically trained teacher would be. But it's something that I'm very enthusiastic about because it's really what makes music exciting for everybody and anybody. If you like listening to music, you probably like listening to music because the phrasing that you hear is good. If you listen to bad music all the time, the phrasing's probably not that interesting. And so that phrasing that your favorite artist uses, the way they sing, how they lean into the notes, right? There are many different versions of similar songs or the same song. And those different versions are a lot of times characterized by how the person sung them. And if you like a certain cover, it might be because the artist used a phrasing that really struck you or was really engaging as they phrased the words as they were singing them. But to keep it a little bit more accessible, I will try and play lots of examples and let you know kind of what phrasing is and the different ways you can think about it with my own playing. All right? So let's dive right in. And I'm going to play a 4-note line. How about those 4 notes? Really simple. And I'm just trying to play them as clean as possible, as intentional as possible. But depending on what's happening in the music, I could play those 4 notes in any way and make them sound vastly, vastly different. In order to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to put my metronome going. That was a large number of ways that you could play the same 4 notes with different rhythmic phrasing, different sort of attitudes that you can give those same 4 notes. You listen to it the first time, you think, oh, there's nothing to that. It's boring. But it's boring because I didn't phrase it any kind of interesting, and you didn't have any kind of a context for it because there wasn't any timing reference. But because of how I changed the phrasing of the notes as I moved along and how I put the notes in different places on the time, it became a lot more interesting, I hope. And I tried to, for each of those examples, except for the last 2, I tried to play a slightly different phrase each time. It's hard to remember exactly what I had already played, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how many variations, and that's just some of them. That's just what came off the top of my head in the moment for those 12 or whatever different variations that I played. And then at the end, I went back to the straight version, which you can hear after everything else. It sounds a little plain. And that's fine, but once you've had a taste of phrasing, it really becomes part of how you express what you express. And so this 4-note exercise is a great way for anybody to get started with phrasing. It can seem like a really large subject because it's a little vague. There is not a whole lot of anchor points to really pin down your thought process for phrasing. But what you can do is you can intentionally give yourself bumpers on the sides so that you generally go in the right direction. And so by limiting the amount of notes that you can play, and by playing a select set of notes, you can focus on the phrasing instead of focusing on, what note should I play, right? This isn't a podcast on soloing, though phrasing and soloing can be closely related. You want to focus on the phrasing. So that pattern that I was playing there is just G, A, C, and D. And I'm just playing it on the 3rd fret and the 5th fret of the E and the A strings. So if you take those 4 notes and you start playing them, you can try and push and pull where you're putting the different notes, right? The easiest way to do this is just take one of the notes and play it longer. And then once you get back to the rest of the notes, play them normally. So if this is normal, then take the first note and stay on the first note longer. You just phrased those notes. Now try and move which note stays longer. And how long you stay on the note is kind of up to your judgment. Try and feel some sort of a beat in your body and stick to that. But you can just advance the long note along. And now I'm going to move it so the long note is the third note. And the fourth note. That's basically just the basic pattern, and we're just holding the last note. So that's the basics of phrasing. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you in the next episode. No. That is just a very basic way of approaching it, but it's important to start basic. If you just start diddling and expect to come up with something great, you might, not saying you wouldn't, but it's a lot easier, I find, when you give yourself a very specific set of options so that you're not overwhelmed by too many things happening. You can just really hone in on what you're trying to achieve. And in this case, it's the phrasing. So another way that you could phrase those notes is by skipping faster, right? We held one note longer. But what happens if we speed up one of the notes instead of slowing it down? Let's do the same thing, and I'll work it through each of the notes in the sequence. So we'll start by skipping over the first note quickly. I'll move away from it faster, and then playing the other notes normally. If you want, you could go back to the beginning of the phrase when you get to the end, because the fourth note, in order to speed up the fourth note, you have to have somewhere to go, and you could just go back to the beginning if you wanted to. So that would be another option for phrasing. You can slow down, you can speed up. These are just the note options, right? Or the rhythmic options in this case. What if we take one of those rhythms and we change the notes? That would be a different kind of phrasing. We'd be phrasing the notes that we're using. Let's use this one. So we're kind of holding long on the second note and speeding through the third note. All right? It's just a rhythmic thing that we can latch onto and relate to other notes. Okay? So if we take that, what if we change one of the notes? So now instead of playing the third note as the C, what if I move it down to the B? Just because we can. Right? Changes dramatically what we expect to hear. What if I move it again so that now instead of it being the third fret C or the second fret B, what if I make the third note the seventh fret? So now I'm playing on the E string, third fret, fifth fret, G, A. And then from the seventh fret on the A string, I'm playing E to D. Now it becomes like kind of a call and response. You could almost play the first bit and then play that higher bit that moves down as the answer. Right? And this is how you write a melody. You just kind of start playing around with things and seeing what works, changing the rhythm if you feel like the rhythm should change, changing the notes if you want to try and change the notes. But those basically are the main components of phrasing, or the components that you should start by thinking about. So if you have a set of notes that you really like, Maybe you don't want to change the notes. Maybe you want to change the rhythm. Or if you have a rhythm that you think is kind of cool and groovy and it's kind of, got a little bit of a vibe to it, maybe you change the notes. Maybe the notes are bland and you want to try altering those, but not changing the rhythm. Something that's really interesting that allows you to kind of transplant phrasing from other things is to take either the melody or the rhythm from a song and play it with different notes or with a different rhythm, respectively. So if I go back to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and play the rhythm from Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the rhythm goes, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, right? That would be the rhythm. And if I was to play just a random set of notes with that rhythm, it's going to automatically kind of seed an idea for a phrasing. Right? It doesn't sound like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but I used the rhythm from Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to create something with a unique phrase that I otherwise maybe wouldn't have thought of. What if I use the rhythm from Row, Row, Row Your Boat? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Da 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 da. Doesn't sound anything like row, row, row your boat, but I borrowed the rhythm to create an idea. And by having that rhythm that I knew I was working off of, I could kind of look into the future and see where I was going to hold notes, see where I needed to play a little bit faster. And it really gave me a strong idea of how I wanted to move the pitch of the notes, how I wanted to group things in order to make it make sense with the rhythm. And if you're just beginning phrasing or just beginning improvising, you are not going to be able to do this. You're just going to be kind of poking around in the dark to see what happens. You're just going to be exploring, and maybe you can't make an advanced or an in-advanced informed decision because you're not really used to seeing into the future like that. You're just kind of responding with what happens or what just happens to come out of your fingers. But as you get a little bit better, or if you revisit something after you've played it a couple times, you might be able to rearrange what's going on so that the phrase that you play with that borrowed rhythm becomes a little bit more musical and a little bit more intentional. Like I knew that in the middle of the melody, there's the merrily, 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 merrily thing, right? Which is a very specific set of notes if you're following the pitch, but I knew it was triplets, so da 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 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, right? So I decided to play groups of 3 notes in a row, right? And that rhythm inspired that. I wouldn't have necessarily thought to put those groups of 3 in that spot unless the rhythm had specified that, which it did. So it kind of gave me an idea for the phrasing in that spot or how I would want to phrase the notes. On the other side of the coin, you can take the melody from a song and change the rhythm and come up with something different as well. Okay? This one is a little bit harder to pull off because the melody, the pitch of the notes tends to be a little bit more iconic maybe than the rhythm, especially with songs that are simple and have simple rhythms. I am going to have to really try and go out in the weeds to make it sound not like the melody, but I'll see what I can do. Let's start with Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I'm going to try and play the notes of the melody, but change the rhythm so that it's unfamiliar. Right? We're doing the opposite of what we just did. And maybe you don't need to play every single note exactly the correct number of times. That might tie you into the melody a little bit too much, and it's hard to be original. But if you move things around, you can be a little bit more lenient on what's happening when, and so moving the rhythms might become a little bit easier. But that's a little bit harder because the notes are more intrinsically matched to the melodies that we're familiar with. And, people sing with bad timing or they play with bad timing all the time. They're still like, oh, hey, I know that song. So it's a little bit easier to overlook the bad timing or the different timing that's strange, and it's still possible to kind of see through that and hear the melody you expect to hear. Let's see what happens if I try and do row, row, row your boat. It's hard to do. If you need a challenge, I would do this one. If you're just starting out, it's a lot easier to change the notes but use the same rhythm. So those are a couple of ways that you can practice phrasing. I think a lot of what learning phrasing is just kind of imagining the possibilities and getting used to the options that you have. A lot of times as folks learn music, especially if you're learning in a Western context, you're used to playing what is given to you and you don't alter that. It's just, that's what it is. That's how I learned it, or that's how my teacher plays it, or that's how it's played on the record, whatever it might be. It doesn't necessarily occur to folks to change the phrasing and to kind of, reinterpret what is happening in the song. Something that I really like is listening to covers of the same song. Listen to how different people cover the song. I'm not necessarily talking about just like how your friend plays Free Fallin' or whatever, because a lot of times musicians who maybe don't have any other reference are going to play it a lot more like the record than somebody who wants to make an artistic statement. But somebody who is really kind of converting a cover from something that maybe you wouldn't expect to something that works in their genre or with their style, then you really hear how the phrasing can change to match that style. A really good example that I like is Rusty Cage by Soundgarden. Johnny Cash covered that song. And so if you go listen to the Soundgarden version of Rusty Cage, it's, boo-boo-ga, 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 it's a grunge, metal-y rock song. And then Johnny Cash figured out how to adapt it to his country western style, and you would think that Johnny Cash wrote that song. It's just the way that he converted it and he changed the phrasing to work with his style is just really amazing. And I believe there's also a Johnny Cash song that Chris Cornell of Soundgarden covered later on. It might have been the last recording he did, actually. But that's also an interesting example of phrasing going the other way. What happens if you take a kind of country song from Johnny Cash and you play it in the style of Chris Cornell from Soundgarden? How does he approach it? How does he phrase it differently? And that's just one example. There are many. But take a favorite song that you know and see if you can find other versions of the song that are significantly different. Another one I can think of is Elton John's Yellow Brick Road. Sarah Bareilles did a lovely cover of that song on her live album, and she phrases it very different. She kind of reinvents the song. And I think that as an artist, if you're going to cover a song, that's sort of what you need to do, to give it your own spin and to make it so you're not just trying. Or like James Hill's version of Billie Jean. He doesn't try and sing it because that would be absurd, right? Trying to sing Michael Jackson, that's just crazy. But he interpreted it with a different kind of phrasing. And he decided, okay, well, I'm just going to rap the words. And he really kind of changes the phrasing. Even if he was singing it, the phrasing would be very different. So take advantage of those examples that are already given and hear how artists change the phrasing from what you're used to hearing in the original version. It's super fascinating, and there's a wealth of examples out there. Check them out, see if you can find your own, and also check out those that I mentioned, the Rusty Cage, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and James Hill's Billie Jean. So with that said, I will leave you with myself making an effort to kind of reinterpret one of my songs by changing the rhythm. And I'll see if I can do it a few different ways. Not sure what the results are going to be like, because it's very unnatural to do something like this to a song that you wrote, something that is so embedded kind of in your musical conscience. But I'll see what I can do. This is it normally. This is how I recorded it, kind of how I know the song and how I intended the song to be. It's called The Jig Is Up. It's on my album If Only. Etc. It's pretty straight. It's kind of got that rolling Celtic 6/8 sort of a feel. I'm going to see what I can do to change it from that feel. That's like the Sheryl Crow version or whatever. It's a little bit more straight, a little bit more like, maybe adult rocky straight. That's a way you could play the song. And, maybe on another plane, the Brad in that alternate universe chose to phrase the song that way and kind of have that approach to the song. Let's see if I can come up with one more. Maybe that's like the jazz version. I was kind of hearing like brushes in my head. And granted, the way that I'm playing this song, I'm changing the timing feel of the song. And that's, maybe can think of that as like phrasing of the genre. I'm changing the phrasing of the genre and of the musical overall approach. But each different genre and time that you play a song in is going to kind of affect how you phrase the notes and other parts of the song as well. So you don't necessarily need to stay in the same exact time as the original song to change the phrasing. You can draw inspiration from changing the phrasing by changing the style that you're playing the song in. If you think like, okay, how would a country player play this song? you're going to end up with a different kind of phrasing than you would of, oh, how would a pop singer from the last decade write this song or approach this song, right? It gives you different inspirations for creating a different kind of a phrasing. And really, that's all you can ask for, is just to find some sort of inspiration that builds upon what you already have and allows you to kind of push off from there and find a new phrasing, an alternative phrasing. There's nothing wrong with ever playing anything straight, but that phrasing and that little bit of change in the attitude is going to be what makes it your own. It's what makes it sound like you're playing the song as opposed to the original artist playing the song. If you want to hear more about phrasing, I recommend going back and listening to Jeff Peterson's podcast. When he was on the podcast a handful of episodes ago, he had some really interesting thoughts on phrasing and kind of the classical version of the phrasing and how he interprets it from there with the push and the pull of the timing and those sorts of different things. He's probably much more equipped to speak to phrasing than I am. I just kind of think about it from my little, very limited perspective. I would like to get more into phrasing, but really I find that a lot more of my teaching is just spent trying to get people to play on time and, become comfortable just jamming or whatever the core basics are. The phrasing is a little bit more of an advanced concept. And that's not to say that beginners or intermediate players can't explore it and learn more about it and try and phrase different things. It's just that in the kind of hierarchy stack of musical priorities, timing and just overall comfort with the material goes above phrasing, I think. Because you got to have a foundation to build on. You got to crawl before you can walk and walk before you can run. That's just the way it goes. Don't make the rules. If I was in charge, everybody would just have the basics down and we could go on and talk about phrasing for every single class. But that's not necessarily how it works. And so as a result, I don't get to think about it a whole lot, and I would like to. So hopefully you found that helpful. If you liked what you heard on the podcast, please subscribe, tell your friends, all of that good stuff. The podcast is published on the first and third Saturday of every month. And coming up on April 9th, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.-ish, we're going to be hosting Ukes for Ukraine over on YouTube. It's a live stream fundraiser for World Central Kitchen, who is on the ground in Ukraine, cooking food for folks. We're going to be teaching ukulele all day, playing some songs for you guys. Lots of great artists lined up. Tobias Elof, Victoria Vox, Neil Chin, Kevin Carroll, Craig Chi / maybe Sarah Mizell. Not sure which of them is going to present a workshop. They're both helping me out, though, making it all happen. And myself and my mentor, Kiyoki Kahumoku, we will be playing a few songs at the very end of the event. But please, come join us if you can, even just to pop by for a second. It's free to tune in, though, of course, any donations are completely welcome. Whatever you can contribute to the cause is greatly appreciated. But more than anything, just come join us, be part of the community for that day. There will be stuff going on for quite a large window, so no matter where you're at in the world, hopefully you can catch some of it. And if you can't make it, it will be available for rebroadcast or watching afterwards, whatever they call that. I can't remember what they call that. But the donations will be open till the end of April. That will be the official end of the fundraiser. So if you don't get a chance to join us live, please tune in afterwards. And if you needed an excuse to throw some money towards World Central Kitchen and wanted to provide some relief for some of the folks who are struggling out in Ukraine, you can do so. I hope you'll join us. Please tell your friends, download the flyer off of liveukulele.com/Ukraine, post it on your Facebook, your Instagram, paste it to your dog, walk them around the neighborhood, whatever you can do to help spread the word would be greatly appreciated. And I hope to see you at the event. All my very best. I will catch you in the next episode. Be well out there. Peace.